My father was born and raised and grew up in Oberhausen, Germany. He was born in 1913, so if you do the math, you realize that he found himself in the midst of the Nazi uprising and the Holocaust. In 1932, he determined he was very concerned that Hitler was going to be in power and hoped that he would go away. And so my father decided to escape to Belgium for a while. He had family there, and wait Hitler out. By 1937, he realized that that was not going to happen, so he snuck back into Germany, took my grandmother and put her in a Catholic nursing home, and they passed her off as a Catholic. She later died of cancer. While he was there, and after he had placed her in the home, two of his classmates, who were Christians, who were also German soldiers, came to him and said they had seen his name on the list and that he was about to be picked up. Imagine, two German soldiers who my father had befriended in high school came and warned him. And as a result, he went to the train station with nothing. He bought a ticket on a train going in one direction, and he got underneath the train of a train going to Switzerland, holding on underneath, literally riding the rails, and that's how he got into Switzerland. His goal was to find a Jewish woman to marry who had a Swiss passport, because he knew a Swiss passport could get him into anywhere. And he did that, found my mother. They married in 1938, and they immediately fled and were able to get into Panama. And they lived there for 4 years, didn't like the political climate, so my mother came to the United States in 1941 to Dallas. She brought my father over 6 months later, and they caught up with him about a year later, the American government, and gave him a choice. He could either be put in a camp for enemy aliens, or he could join the American Army. So he joined the American Army, and they sent him back to Germany as an American soldier in an Army Air Corps intelligence to interrogate German prisoners of war. And when the war was over, he actually went back. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and he actually went back to his house in Oberhausen, threw out the people who had taken it over, and made him pay back rent. He was a feisty 5-foot man. But he's always been my hero. He was very farsighted. He understood what might go on. But were it not for Christians who were willing to risk their lives to save that of a Jew, I probably wouldn't be here. And so I wanted you to know my story as the backdrop for my opening prayer. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, our God and God of our mothers and fathers, we come before you on this night to remember one of the darkest ages in human history, an age when the world stood by in silence as an evil regime systematically murdered 6 million Jews and millions of Gentiles. These innocent victims of hate were not killed for what they did, but for who they were. Many lie in nameless graves in far-off places. The ashes of others have been scattered to the winds, wiping out generations of greatness that might have been. All of them endured cruel suffering and unspeakable fear. All of them looked for a release that never came. We know, God, that we cannot undo what was done, but we pray that with your help, we might be able to give meaning to the memory of those who perished. In a world of absurdity, show us the way to find reason. Wherever genocide raises its ugly hand, give us the courage to defeat it, no matter the cost, political or otherwise. And help us to remember the words that Protestant pastor Martin Niemöller offered when he, an outspoken critic of Hitler in Germany, looked back on the Holocaust after spending the last 7 years of Nazi rule in a concentration camp. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Please, God, give us the courage to speak out so holocausts never happen again. Amen. And now I give you Dr. Matthew Tapey from St. Leo's College, who's the rector of the Catholic Jewish Interfaith Opportunity.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you for your words.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Matthew Tapey. I am the director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies, and I'm also a professor at St. Leo. And I think I have destabilized this microphone. Here we go. It's a real joy for me to be here tonight and for us to be together. Thank you for coming out. I know there's lots of places you could be at a 7 p.m. On a Thursday night at 7 p.m. But it means a great deal to us that you would be here. The Center for Catholic Jewish Studies has been in existence since 1998, so nearly 2 decades now, and its mission is to build mutual respect and understanding between Catholics and Jews and all people of goodwill. And so we hope that we will be doing that tonight by focusing and thinking back and meditating upon what for many people marks the beginning of the Holocaust, Kristallnacht, 79th anniversary, the night of broken glass, where over 400 synagogues attacked, burned, damaged, torched. And so we come together tonight to remember that. And we do so with great guides, wonderful, excellent guides. And I want to introduce them now at this time. First, and both of them, I should say, also are my friends. And I'm grateful to have them here with us. My first person to introduce to you is a fantastic scholar of the churches in Nazi Germany. Her name is Dr. Victoria Barnett. She is the director of the program on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She is a graduate of Indiana University, Union Theological Seminary, and George Mason University. She's the author of For the Soul of the People, Protestant Protest Against Hitler, and the book Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust. She is also editor and translator of Wolfgang Gerlach's And the Witnesses Were Silent, The Confessing Church and the Jews. And she's also the author of the new revised edition of Eberhard Bethge's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a biography. From 2004 to 2014, Dr. Barnett served as one of the general editors of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works, the English translation series of Bonhoeffer's complete works published by Fortress Press. She has written numerous articles and book chapters on the churches during the Holocaust. Her newest books, just released weeks ago, are After 10 Years, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Our Times, and also the collected sermons of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Volume 2. Our other distinguished guest tonight is Rabbi James Rudin. Rabbi Rudin holds honorary doctorates from St. Leo University, St. Martin's University. He is the distinguished visiting professor of religion and Judaica at St. Leo University, and he teaches at the Florida Gulf Coast University Renaissance Academy. In 1968, he began his career as a member of the American Jewish Committee's senior professional staff, where he served as the director of the Interreligious Affairs Department. He is currently the AJC's senior interreligious advisor and a member of the organization's board of governors. A former chairman of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, Rabbi Rudin participated in 11 meetings with Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. He was a guest of honor at the 1994 Vatican concert that commemorated the Holocaust. In April 2008, he was chosen by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops to respond to Pope Benedict XVI's address to Jewish leaders in Washington, D.C. Rabbi Rudin is the author or editor of 17 books, and since 1991 has written commentaries for Religion News Service. His latest book is called Pillar of Fire, a biography of Rabbi Stephen Wise, published in 2015. Would you please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests?
Thank you very much, Matt. Can you hear me all right? Yell loudly if you don't hear me. It really is a pleasure to be here this evening. I want to especially thank Father Plaseski for hosting us here at Christ the King, and of course, Matt Tappy for inviting me to speak down today in Tampa, and again to thank Rabbi Rudin for being on the program with me. We only met for the first time today, and for me it is such an honor because I've admired his work for so long. I want to begin this evening with a slight disclaimer because the story of Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic responses during the Holocaust is such an enormous topic that if I were to really describe this history even generally, we might be here for a very long time. But sometimes it's possible to get deeper insights into a big topic like this when you start small, when you start with a small case study. And so this evening I'm going to begin with such a close-up view by looking at the responses during that era of a small group of Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant leaders in the United States. And I'll begin with an interfaith snapshot from the summer of 1932. That's when Reverend Everett Clinchy, a Presbyterian staff member of the Federal Council of Churches in New York, and the director of a new organization called the National Conference of Christians and Jews, made a fact-finding trip to Germany. The Federal Council was a Protestant interdenominational body with representatives of about 33 mainline denominations that dealt largely with social issues. It was the precursor of today's National Council of Churches. And the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which I'll just call the NCCJ, was initially a division of the Federal Council, but became independent in 1932, and as the name suggests, it focused on interfaith issues in the United States. Its staff included Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, and it came into being at a moment in American history where there was a resurgence of racism, anti-Catholicism, and anti-Semitism. The NCCJ's stated purpose was to combat all these forms of prejudice by having representatives of the three faiths stand together as an example of the values of American democracy, and its goals were to work for common ground between the three faiths. So in the summer of 1932, these officials began to get alarming reports about the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany. And so Clinchy traveled to Germany, joined for part of his trip by two colleagues from the Federal Council, Samuel Cavert and Henry Smith Leeper. Clinchy spent several weeks in Berlin, speaking with German Quakers, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. His host was a man named Bernhard Kahn, a Swedish-born physician who in 1901 had founded a Jewish welfare organization in Germany for refugees from the pogroms in Eastern Europe. Kahn later fled Nazi Germany in 1933. He went to Paris, where he became an important ally of James MacDonald in his effort to help refugees from Nazi Germany. And Kahn was also one of the representatives for the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee at the 1938 Evian Conference, which dealt with the refugee question. But in 1932, Kahn was one of a small circle of Christians and Jews in Berlin who had been working together on social issues and were gratefully fearful about the growing strength of the National Socialist Party. One of his closest allies was a Protestant pastor named Friedrich Sigmund Schulze, the founder and director of a social welfare organization in East Berlin. Sigmund Schulze's center during the 1920s had been staffed by Quakers, Protestants, Jews, socialists, and staunch atheists. Many of the people who worked there were women, and it's very striking when you follow what happens to these women after 1933, how many of them then become involved in resistance and rescue activities in Nazi Germany. One of them, a Quaker named Herta Kraus, eventually got to the United States, and she ended up directing the American Friends Service Committee rescue work during the Second World War. Sigmund Schulze himself was arrested and expelled from Nazi Germany in July of 1933 for his work with the Jewish community. Sigmund Schulze and Kahn set up various meetings for Everett Clinchy and his colleagues to give them a first-hand impression of what was happening in Germany. Fortunately, Clinchy was traveling with his wife Winifred, who kept a detailed diary of their journeys, and much of my research has been based upon Winifred Clinchy's diary. Everett Clinchy kept a little notebook with very short little comments about where he about his meetings. But Winifred went into great detail with who they met with, what they eat, and what they talked about. And so we get a glimpse from her diary of what Jews and Christians in Germany were thinking in the summer of 1932. The Clinchys met some Nazis, including Putzi Hanfstangl, a German-born alumnus of Harvard who was already acting as Hitler's informal ambassador to the United States, and who described the political atmosphere to them as thrilling. Sigmund Schulze told them that Germans were already living in an atmosphere of civil war, and that, in his words, every day, 5 or 6 people are murdered for political reasons. A Quaker leader told them that he didn't think the Nazi question was very important. Bernard Kahn, in contrast, said that the Jewish community in Germany was increasingly fearful, that he himself had become the target of open anti-Semitism and threats, and that, quote, if Hitler came in, many Jews would leave if they could afford it, unquote. Clinchy met with Richard Horlacher, a Protestant member of a newly founded German organization to fight anti-Semitism, Wilhelm Kleemann, head of the Jewish People's Party, and Georg Landauer, a leading German Zionist. And on the morning of July 8th, 1932, the Clinchys were walking through the lobby of the Kaiserhof Hotel on their way to breakfast and ran into Adolf Hitler, coming out of the elevator all by himself. As Winifred Clinchy wrote in her diary, he was small, quiet, with no pose to him, and no one seemed to stampede as he walked through the lobby. Clinchy returned to the United States and published a short 30-page booklet called The Strange Case of Herr Hitler, trying to explain what was happening in Germany to Americans, and his booklet came out shortly after January 1933. Hitler, he wrote, and these are his words, was riding skillfully like a Hawaiian surfboard expert on the crest of a wave of nationalism. For the Germans, National Socialism was, quote, an emotional, sentimental, romantic experience, end of quote. Hitler played anti-Semitism like an old tune, used by German leaders in former generations to strike up the band for a parade of nationalism. But Clinchy also acknowledged the centuries of Christian anti-Jewish teachings that had laid the foundation for such anti-Semitism, and he described Christians in Germany as, quote, mentally sick, unquote, in their persecution of the Jews. Henry Kleeper and Sam Cavert also returned with warnings about German anti-Semitism, and in fact, Leeper also published a book in 1933 titled A Personal View of the German Churches Under the Revolution, in which he warned that ethno-nationalism had become linked with religion throughout Europe and was now confronting the German Protestant church with its greatest challenge. The point of this is that when the Nazis came to power in January 1933, there were at least some American religious leaders who understood what this meant and were clear especially about the threat that the Nazi regime posed to German Jews. American Catholics, Protestants, and Jews became deeply engaged in those early months. They continued to receive reports from people in Germany about what was going on there. In October 1933, for example, there was a meeting of U.S. interfaith leaders at the home of Harry Emerson Fosdick in New York. Fosdick was the rector, the pastor of Riverside Church, and had a very prominent pulpit in New York. But before Riverside Church, or as it was in the process of being built, the Baptist community there had no place to worship, and so they actually worshiped in Congregation Bethel, Stephen Wise's temple, on the east side of New York while Riverside was being built. So Fosdick and Stephen Wise were old friends, and the meeting in Fosdick's home was attended by Stephen Wise, by Henry Leeper, by John Lafarge and John Walsh, two very prominent Catholic theologians, the Unitarian leader John Haynes Holmes, and several others. The report that they read had truly horrifying accounts of anti-Semitic violence in Germany, including one report about 4 Jewish brothers who had been arrested, tortured, and murdered, with their mutilated bodies returned to the family. The Federal Council of Churches and the NCCJ began to send letters of protest to their Protestant counterparts at church offices in Berlin. Henry Smith Leeper stated the American case succinctly. He said, "The Jew does not always have an easy time in the United States, to be sure, But as you know, there is a very deeply rooted conviction in the American mind that religious freedom is an unalienable right of man, end of quote. It was the first of a number of such protests, all of which were met by German church leaders with annoyance, denials, open anti-Semitism, and defenses of the new Nazi regime. These American voices of protest also begin to receive other messages from their contacts, including Sigmund Schulze himself, who by this time was in Swiss exile, warning of a Nazi backlash against the churches if foreign church leaders spoke out too strongly. A bitter fight had broken out in the German Protestant church between a pro-Nazi faction that wanted to Nazify the church and those opposed to this. Among German Catholics, there was anxiety and division among those who had been involved in the Catholic Center Party, which had been very anti-Nazi, and others. There was a relatively small number of Catholic priests who embraced National Socialism, and a much larger number who simply hoped that the Catholic Church and its institutions could remain independent of Nazi state control. And then in July of 1933 came the signing of the Concordat between the Third Reich and the Vatican, which German Catholics hoped would guarantee their own control of their institutions. And so as they watched all this unfold, the American church leaders who had initially been so outspoken became much more cautious in their comments on what was happening in Nazi Germany. Within the NCCJ itself, divisions were already beginning to open up during 1933 between its Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant supporters. Although alarmed by what was happening in Nazi Germany, for example, Everett Clinchy opposed the calls of many U.S. Jewish leaders for a boycott of German goods, arguing that he feared that this might create anti-German sentiment in the United States and would simply spawn a different kind of prejudice. In turn, Jewish organizations and leaders like Rabbi Stephen Wise charged that the NCCJ was naive and didn't understand the nature of what was happening to Jews in Germany. U.S. Catholic leaders in this country had very mixed reactions to the NCCJ. Some of them feared that Catholic involvement in such interfaith work could amount to unfaithfulness to Catholic doctrine. And for that reason, actually, the NCCJ stayed away from the kinds of theological interfaith dialogues that have characterized much interfaith work in this country since 1945. They focused primarily on this fight against prejudice. But U.S. Catholic leaders were also nervous about the challenges that confronted the Catholic churches in Germany. And after 1936, the big international issue on their minds would be the Spanish Civil War, an issue in which U.S. Catholics largely took the side of the nationalists led by Francisco Franco, and American Protestants and Jews came down on the other side, that of the Spanish Republicans. And over the course of the 1930s, the attention of these American Catholics and Protestants began to turn away from the persecution of the German Jews and more to what was happening to their church partners in Germany, more to broader international issues like the Spanish Civil War or concerns about another broader European war, and to domestic American issues like unemployment. Everett Clinchy at the NCCJ argued that they couldn't afford to focus on what was happening in Germany because they needed to focus on what was happening here in the United States. In other words, at the very moment when the Jews of Europe and the Jews of the United States needed the most, their interfaith allies turned their attention to other matters. While there are some factors here that are unique to the American situation, much of what I just described applies to some of the international reactions of European churches and church organizations. So what does this complicated historical snapshot tell us? First, I think it's an important reminder that even in the 1930s, there was more interaction and cooperation between Jews, Protestants, and Catholics than we often realize. And much of it did focus on what was happening in Nazi Germany and the resulting refugee crisis. Especially in the United States, Christians viewed what was happening in Nazi Germany as a human rights or civil liberties issue. One can see that from the quote I read from Henry Leeper. They've often focused on the Nazis' racialized conception of Jews, sometimes comparing it to racial discrimination in this country, And as a result, the underlying theological issues between Christians and Jews were never addressed or spoken of, although they certainly remained a fault line in that relationship. And as a result of that, Jewish leaders and even Jewish staff members of the NCCJ were distrustful about how much they could really count on their Christian colleagues. This was underscored as Catholic and Protestant leaders in the United States began to speak more broadly of Hitler's persecution of religion as a whole, lumping together the plight of German Catholics, Protestants, and Jews together, and failing to recognize the very particular threat that was posed to German Jews. This is already evident in Henry Leeper's 1933 book on the German churches. In contrast, the alarm of the Jewish community was growing, not just because of what was happening in Nazi Germany, but because of a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in the United States. The 1930s saw a boom in right-wing hate groups, many of them inspired by what was happening in Nazi Germany. According to one 1941 report, for example, the number of such groups that were being tracked rose from 5 in 1932 to 119 in 1939. Perhaps compared with today's numbers of hate groups, that doesn't seem like a lot. But at the time, it was truly alarming. And as a result of all this, by the mid-1930s, there was indeed what could be described as silence by international church leaders, including some of the Americans I mentioned, about what was happening in Nazi Germany. Alarm at what was happening across the Atlantic became one issue among many, increasingly accompanied by concerns about American problems, as the interfaith solidarity that had existed in early 1933 began to fracture. It was a complicated silence, an ambivalent silence, perhaps more of a paralysis, as people searched for what they could do about what was happening. And it has obscured the real interfaith activity that was going on. Much of this has been ignored by historians, even those who studied the churches during this period. But I think the complexity of interfaith work and the breakdown of solidarity under such pressures of that era go hand in hand. All of this would change very briefly on November 9th, 1938. The events of so-called Kristallnacht, the November pogroms, when the synagogues of Germany were set aflame, Jewish homes and businesses were vandalized, Germany's Jewish citizens were accosted and beaten, and thousands of Jewish men were rounded up and taken to concentration camps, aroused an international outcry, especially by church leaders in the United States. There were 3 national radio broadcasts that were quickly organized. One of them broadcast from Catholic University in Washington, D.C., which featured statements of condemnation by Catholic leaders like Father Joseph Corrigan, who was the president of Catholic University, Bishop Mark Gannon of Erie, Pennsylvania, Bishop Peter Ireton, and Al Smith, the former governor, the Catholic governor of New York State. Many of the statements that were in this broadcast clearly recognized and focused on the immediate threat to Germany's Jews and began to call for changes in American immigration law to allow more Jews to enter this country. Many of the statements framed the violence in Germany and the growing divisions in the United States as a general threat to democratic ideals and appealed to those ideals in uniting the different faiths. And like many of the statements of this era, they also spoke of the violence against German Jews as a kind of racial persecution, but also a more general attack on religion in Nazi Germany. And so many of the statements read on these radio broadcasts warned that the violence against the Jews would inevitably be eventually followed by violence against Germans or against Christians in Germany. Nonetheless, some of these statements are truly remarkable and clear, and if anyone's interested, we actually have the audio of that Catholic University broadcast on the Holocaust Museum website. We have a special feature on how American churches responded to Kristallnacht, and we have that broadcast embedded. Father Corrigan, for example, said, "Where in the light of the fury of inhumanity raging in Germany, where is the Christianity that once reigned in a Christian nation?" Not on the broadcast, but as a follow-up to it, there was an article in the Christian Century several weeks later in 1938 where it said the Christian church must make its own position clear and dissociate itself from this calculated cruelty and paganized racial nationalism help those immediate victims, and strive to immunize the rest of the world to the contagion of this spirit. And in Geneva, Switzerland, the World Council of Churches issued a statement on November 16, 1938, where it said, "At the moment when a terrible persecution of the Jewish population in Germany has come to a violent climax, it is our duty to remind ourselves of the stand that we have taken as an ecumenical movement against anti-Semitism in all its forms." As these statements show, there were voices of protest, but they didn't coalesce into a broader political movement that really could change either refugee policy in this country or begin to articulate how American and European leaders and diplomats should address the growing emergency in Germany in a different fashion. And so that initial outrage, which is very striking when you look at the literature of Christian publications and Christian churches in those months after November 1938, then begins to dissipate and die down, and then again the plight of the European Jews begins to become subsumed under other concerns. We should neither overestimate nor underestimate the centrality of the people I've been speaking about. These leaders were prominent in their day. There weren't many of them. There certainly weren't enough of them. But in their positions in their respective churches, they had some influence that they tried to bring upon what was happening. One must also say, for the reasons that I just described, they failed, because when a people is persecuted over a number of years, and ultimately when 6 million members of that people are murdered in cold blood, that's a massive failure on all levels of governments, of diplomacy, and I would say of the churches. So the history that we're talking about gives some insight not just into religious responses to National Socialism, but the real complexity that was behind these responses, which are not easily categorized either as silence or as protests. In fact, one aspect of the complexity is that I think the movement from silence to protest is neither smooth nor logical, but often occurs in fits and starts, sometimes accelerating, sometimes retreating, and it's one of the many realities that makes this history complicated in general. A few concluding observations. The first one is that to protest the evils unfolding in Nazi Germany required a clarity and decisiveness that was often not present. One of the striking things about that 1932 visit to Berlin is that these people really did get a glimpse and hear directly from those affected in Berlin of what this movement was about. But people who were not in Berlin, people who were simply reading the newspapers in this country, had a hard time grasping the reality. A wonderful example of that is the story of Rabbi Morris Lazarin, a Reformed rabbi from Baltimore, who was the national staff person for the NCCJ. Lazarin went to Berlin in the spring of 1935. A really stunning time for an American rabbi to visit Berlin. But he went there to do what he thought, he went there thinking that he could do what he had been doing for the NCCJ. Oh, cell phones. He went there to do what he'd been doing for the NCCJ in the United States. That is, Lazarin actually thought that in Berlin he might be able to replicate the kinds of interfaith dialogues that the NCCJ had been doing in the United States. So he went, this sounds a little crass, but it's kind of what he was hoping to do, thinking that he could bring Jews and Nazis and Protestants and Catholics around the table for a potluck, and they would talk to each other and they would work out their differences. But as soon as Lazarin got in Berlin, literally within the first week, he realized that what was happening in Nazi Germany was something completely different. Lazarin stayed in Berlin for about 4 months. He ended up helping every Jew he could try to get a visa to the United States, wrote literally several hundred letters to various places in the United States trying to help German Jews escape. And when he returned to the United States in June of 1935, Lazarin wrote a very moving letter to American Jewish leader Paul Berwald, in which he wrote, and these are his words, "No one who has seen what I've seen and heard what I've heard can ever be quite the same. It is a searing but sobering thing to go down into the abyss. Our people don't really know, I mean deeply comprehend, what this is all about, what is at stake. A malignant force has been let loose in the world against us, end of quote. Lazarin recognized what was happening once he got to Berlin, but his story illustrates how many people outside Nazi Germany, even good people, excuse me, didn't automatically understand that even in 1935. My second point, protesting the violence and persecution against the Jews in Germany also meant understanding the very specific nature of that persecution, not seeing it simply as a collapse of democracy, not seeing it as one symptom among many, as an offshoot of dangerous nationalism, or a sign of the general Nazi antipathy toward all religions. While we do need to understand the systemic nature of evil, in times of great evil like this, one needs to go directly to help the victims, and this was one of the failures in the 1930s. While the Christian churches in Germany indeed came under pressure in Nazi Germany, Christians were never targeted for annihilation as the Jewish population was. Excuse me. And this recognition, which was very rare among Christian leaders during that period, was key for understanding what happened after 1939. When the German army marched across Europe, Jews everywhere were in danger, showing that this wasn't simply a Nazi thing. And we know now how many more of them were betrayed and even murdered by their neighbors in occupied countries, all of which were largely Christian countries. My third concluding point is a broader reflection. Excuse me. I've studied this history for several decades now, and in the past 10 years or so, I've really focused on this interfaith history. And my questions on this topic have only deepened. One of my biggest questions is why the surge of outrage and anger and protest that we see in 1933 and that we see again in 1938 didn't coalesce into a broader political movement that might have really affected policy and popular attitudes in this country, because 1938 was a moment when the United States could have taken in more refugees, and when diplomats and governments around the world might have found a different way of addressing the actions of the Nazi regime. But one of the things that the history does illustrate is that preventing the evils of the 1930s and the 1940s is not just a matter of moving from silence to protest, but to something beyond that I think we still haven't quite figured out yet. So it's incorrect to think that people didn't know, or that simply informing people can move them to effective action. Because as my remarks this evening show, many religious leaders did know, were concerned, and attempted in their own way to respond, often in an interfaith fashion. Why this failed is a troubling puzzle, but a very important one that I continue to wrestle with. And I think that these questions go to the heart of the complexity of this history. And perhaps at this particular moment, 79 years after that terrible night in Germany, these remain very fruitful questions for all of us to reflect on within our own faith communities, but especially in conversation with one another. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I want to thank everyone who's made this night possible. I'm a refugee from Fort Myers, and I'm glad that as many of you came out tonight on a Thursday night in Tampa to Father Len, to my colleague, Rabbi Bernholtz. You had a father. Let me tell you one story about my father during World War II. Both my parents were born in Pennsylvania, and I always tell the story that had I been born in Transylvania, instead of Pennsylvania, I too would not be here tonight. I would be one of the 1.5 million Jewish children who were born in the 1930s. So Pennsylvania is very good to me, but I grew up in Virginia. My father was a United States lieutenant colonel in the Dental Corps. And in 1945, because he knew German, though he was born in Pittsburgh, he was assigned, and get ready for this, about American intelligence service in 1945. Professor Barnett, who is a world-class scholar in this, lives in my state where I grew up in Virginia. Not far from Alexandria is an old Confederate fort which in 1945 was converted to a German POW camp for generals who were captured, German generals, and brought over 48 hours from Europe. Now you got to figure this intelligence service. My father was a dentist. Because he knew German, he would work on their teeth and extract not their teeth, but intelligence reports. But only one problem. When you're in a dental chair and your mouth is open, it's a one-way conversation from the dentist to you. You don't have much chance to talk back. My father asked the colonel in charge, get me out of this. He was very blunt. He said, this was January 1945, he said, if I have to stay here one day longer, I'll kill them with my drugs and Novocaine. Because what he was hearing when the Germans were allowed to speak, when my father wasn't working on their teeth, was horrifying and reflects some of the stories that we know very much about the Holocaust. The rabbi who inspired me to become a rabbi was imprisoned on Kristallnacht. He and his wife came to Alexandria in 1939. He was in Dachau in 1938. His name was Hugo Schiff, and because of his inspirational leadership, I was inspired to join Richard Bernholtz in the rabbinate. So we all have our stories, and this is the first point I'd like to make in response to Professor Barnett's excellent presentation. The Shoah, the Holocaust, yes, it's a large number, but it's, as you heard tonight, it's a story of one by one by one by one. Everyone has a story, everyone who was ever affected. And the men and women that Professor Barnett was speaking about in the 1930s were a gallant, small group, as she indicated. They saw things, they understood things, they tried to be the alarm for America, but tried to understand what America was going through in 1938. Charles Lindbergh was still very popular, the American aviator, the hero. In a few years, he was spewing in Des Moines, Iowa, a horrible anti-Semitic speech, and yet he had his followers. The German-American Bund was active and very much in the neighborhood in New York City where my wife and I have lived for many years, what is now called the Upper East Side, but of course it had a different feeling on 86th Street. If you know New York, it was called Broadhurst Boulevard. Father Coughlin, Charles Coughlin of the Detroit area, had a radio broadcast that was heard by millions of people each week, spewing forth vicious anti-Semitic venom until he was finally silenced eventually by the hierarchy. So the United States of 1938 was not particularly receptive to opening the gates so that Jewish refugees could come in. And after Kristallnacht, which was a widely reported event, it was on the front page of the iconic newspaper called the New York Times, the German government in Berlin warily awaited what was going to be the reaction, particularly of the United States. Would the United States impose sanctions on Germany? Would the United States seize overseas German property and assets? Would the United States break off diplomatic relations with Germany? Would the United States crack finally the quota system so that more refugees from Nazi terror could come in? We, of course, know the answer. In each case, it was no. And so it's important to remember that the United States in 1938, a gallant democracy, which knew about Kristallnacht, very much so, they certainly knew, was not willing to do some of the things that was necessary. But Professor Barnett is correct when she points out it would be a great mistake, particularly for my Jewish brothers and sisters, to believe that there was no Christian response to Kristallnacht. There was. And that's the gallant brand we should remember. That's the group of people who were the pathfinders, who understood and saw, particularly firsthand in some cases, what was happening. Let me try to bring another point in about America's response and America's view of itself. I grew up in, as you must gather, Alexandria, Virginia, home of not only George Washington, but a man very much in the news today, Robert E. Lee. But America that I grew up with, and maybe you grew up with, after World War II, had a very, very condescending kind of response to all of this, a reaction. Didn't they know? How could they have done this? Where was the rest of the world? There was a kind of innocence and a purity about America following World War II. But I'm here to say that tonight, after Watergate, after Vietnam, after Jim Crow, after the fight for civil rights and human rights that's still going on, we have lost our innocence. And I think that's a good thing. I think we can see very clearly now what was happening in 1933 and 1938. The courageous Christian men and women who tried to alert our country to what was taking place deserve enormous praise. But 79 years from now, God willing, there will be another Professor Victoria Barnett and another James Rudin and another group who will come, and they will look back on us and say, that generation also knew what was taking place throughout the world. That generation also knew people were being persecuted for their gender, their sexual orientation, their ethnicity, their nationality, their religion. And what did they do? What did they do? They knew, they were alerted, they were aware, but what did they do? And so I think that's the challenge that is thrown out from those distant voices of the 1930s. They alerted the American public. They made it very clear what they saw and heard in Germany and in other parts, in Austria and elsewhere, where Nazism was in flower. They came back and they wrote and they spoke, and you heard the documentation tonight. But what did America do? We know the answer. And one of the answers which has really haunted me and will haunt me to the day I die, a great Roman Catholic senator from New York who was born in Germany, Robert Wagner, you may remember him, a U.S. senator, a Democrat, and a Republican woman from Massachusetts, a member of the House of Representatives, Edith Norris Rogers, introduced a bill, a bipartisan bill, to admit 20,000 German Jewish children beyond the quota, breaking the quota, extra quota, outside. Eleanor Roosevelt, God bless her, tried to influence her husband, who happened to be the President of the United States, to support that bill, the Wagner-Rogers bill. Rogers a Protestant, Wagner, as I said, a Roman Catholic, one a Republican, one a Democrat. The bill was opposed by isolationists, the America Firsters, and many, many other groups that said, we don't want these 20,000 Jewish children to come here. And the haunting quote that I dug out of my research for the biography of Stephen Wise, it happened to be that FDR's cousin, her husband, was the head of the Immigration Bureau at the time. And Franklin Roosevelt's first cousin said, if we allow 20,000 children to come to America, they will grow into 20,000 ugly adults. The bill never passed. It was never enacted. And 20,000 is such a small number. But I conclude by where I began, one by one by one by one. You have someone here tonight who's one of those ones. Had he not had parents who were wise enough, smart enough, clever enough, strong enough, courageous enough to come to America, he would not be here tonight. So let's look back on the 1930s with some compassion and understanding. And let's honor the heroes and heroines who did speak out, who did offer resistance, who did offer guidance, who did give a warning. Whether those warnings were fully understood, we now know that they were not. But they deserve our honor. And I hope when you speak of America and you speak of America's reaction to the Shoah, you'll understand that there were voices, Christians and Jews, who spoke out, who saw, who heard, who tried so desperately for people to react. They did not. And so this is the night, November the 9th, 1938, into the morning of November the 10th, when Kristallnacht took place in Germany, in Austria, and in parts of the Sudetenland, which is now part of the Czech Republic. We honor those memories of those men and women who suffered so greatly, again, as it was said, not for what they believed, not their ideology, but simply who they were. And I'm grateful to you for coming out tonight, supporting us in the work. And I hope you go home and look in the mirror, as we all do. Not just to see the hair that's missing on my head and the makeup that you need to put on, but look in the mirror and say, what would I have done in 1938? And what am I doing now in 2017? Thank you very much.
What is the U.S. response for the creation of Israel? I know Britain was the main lead, but did the United States... Okay. Yeah.
You ask about the U.S. response to the creation of the State of Israel?
Yes, in the creation of it, how they were...
Well, that's not our topic tonight, but it is in a certain way, because it was only 10 years after Kristallnacht. I'll make it very brief. When I got out of the U.S. Air Force as a chaplain, my first civilian congregation was in Kansas City, Missouri, or its correct pronunciation is Missouri. And in Kansas City, a former U.S. president at the time lived very nearby in Independence, and I had the honor twice of being with Harry Truman, once for an extended 2-hour kind of a one-on-one conversation. We were stuck on a dais at the Muehlbach Hotel at an awful luncheon, and I was forced to give a benediction, which was far more amateurish than yours. And President Truman and I were stuck there, but I was, as a history buff, so delighted. And he spoke very bluntly about it. He said I had to overrule James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of Defense. I had to overrule the Secretary of State, a man that I loved and admired, General George Marshall, both of whom advised against the Zionist hope for a Jewish state in the Middle East. They were absolutely opposed to it. He said his advisor, Clark Clifford, who was a lawyer in the White House, was very much for it. And you know the history. It was Harry Truman himself, 11 minutes after David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel as an independent state in May 14, 1948. It was Harry Truman, as the President of the United States, who immediately it was pro tem or temporary diplomatic relations. So he had to overrule two of his most senior and very important cabinet officials, Secretary of Defense and his the man he really admired very much, George Marshall, who was Secretary of State. So history is not always, and I think this is the point that Professor Barnett, Dr. Barnett, was making. History is not just these irrepressible forces that just move and you can't do anything about it. History is one by one by one by one. There's personal. Harry Truman was there. I will say this, and I always catch hell from a lot of people when I say it. had Franklin Roosevelt still been the president, which he would have been in May 1948 if he was fulfilling his fourth term, I frankly think, if I can play on that pun, frankly think Franklin Roosevelt would not have granted diplomatic recognition to the State of Israel in 11 minutes. And I always ask my father and mother, like most American Jews of the period, they voted for Franklin Roosevelt not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. And I said to my father, Dad, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, I said, why did you vote for him 4 times, particularly in 1940? And this was his answer, which I think is, again, the one by one that we heard about the leaders of the 1930s. He said, Jim, whatever Franklin Roosevelt was, and he was many things, one thing we knew, he was the most important leader in the Western world who was anti-Nazi. That he was anti-Nazi. He was many, many other things, but he said that's what we knew. And so that's the story. So I hope that helps you a little bit about the State of Israel. It was Harry Truman, 11 minutes, and he had to overrule 2 of his senior cabinet members.
I have a comment to make. Professor, you talk about one by one by one by one, and that is very powerful. My husband and I had a chance to visit Germany a few years ago, and we were taken by these small, probably 4 by 4 squares, bronze squares, that every once in a while you would see in the middle of the street, in front of a house, and we were wondering what they were. And the explanation was that there is an artist who is going around and doing research and trying to find Jewish folks who were taken from their homes and murdered. And he, as an artist, he wanted to commemorate these folks. Instead of a big monument, he wanted to commemorate each and every one of them. And so hence the 4 by 4 bronze square that is in the pavement in front of the home where these people were taken from. And we said, but why in the pavement? You know, why don't you put it on the side of the house or something like that? And he said, well, no, can't put it because some of the houses are gone, and so you don't know. And he said, it's in the pavement because in order to read it, you have to go like this. And you have to bow to them in honor. So the 1 by 1 by 1 reminded me of that.
I just wanted to add to that. Those are called Stolpersteine. And the reason that they have it, it means stumbling stone. So that as you're walking down the street, it's raised just enough that you can't help but stumble on it, and then you can see it. And I've written a service for dedication because a number of my congregants whose families came from Germany and had been pushed out purchased and had Stolpersteine made. So for them, I created a service for dedicating.
But what exactly is there that we can do other than to vote for people who will concern themselves more with the wretched refuge of foreign shores, as it says on the Statue of Liberty?
Well, I mean, I don't think for this sophisticated group I needed to spell out that Christians are being persecuted in some parts of the world. There are more refugees tonight than ever in the history of the world, numerically, more. I don't have to tell you what is going on in the former Burma, where Muslims are being persecuted. I don't have to mention in Africa, where tribes, particularly once just recently in Rwanda and in other parts, there's attacks. on one tribe against another. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. So resistance, which is a question, how do you best resist? I think the answer we heard tonight was you resist with what and who you are and where you are in your life and where you are in your community, and by speaking out and crying out. It's not just voting, that's just part of the United States. I'm talking about global problems. And certainly people of faith, that's who we are. That's what we claim we are. And sometimes I'm very proud of people of faith, and sometimes I'm very disappointed. But we always say, oh, didn't they know in 1938 or 1933? I think the facts are, I tried to make it tonight, and Dr. Barnett made it very clear. Americans did know. They knew a lot. Kristallnacht, as I said, was the big news. It was very big news. Front page, certainly, of the Times and of many, many other newspapers. So we can't say they didn't know. They knew very well. It's what you do with the knowledge. What do you do? What do you do with the intelligence that you gather? If this is, and you resist in the different ways that you can. So there's plenty to do, and throughout the world. And and as I said, Muslims are being persecuted in former Burma. Muslims persecute other people. There are refugees coming out of the Middle East. There's so much work to be done, and people of faith especially are, that's our commission. That's our great commission, is to respond, each in our own way. You don't have to be like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and be executed for your beliefs and your actions. No one is asking you to do that in America of 2017, but there are many, many things you can do as Jews, as Catholics, as Protestants, as Muslims. And here in the United States, we have many opportunities to not only express ourselves, but to take direct action and do things. And a group like this knows exactly what to do. History has a way of judging people in moments, sometimes very positively and sometimes very cruelly. Tonight you heard, I think, some new things, at least I did, about American religious leaders who saw things and went to Germany and really came back with reports and made it very clear what they heard and what they saw.
Well, one point I want to make is sometimes we talk politically about whether we want to police the rest of the world. You know, is the U.S. the police? But in a sense, that's kind of what we needed to do then. And there are opportunities to do that now. We do have to think about it. I'm not saying that's what we should do, but that's something that's often brought up when we do jump into other areas that are having issues. Is that what we're supposed to do? Well, maybe we need to think really harder about that and compare that to a situation where maybe we should have jumped in sooner. So, or we definitely should have.
The word Nazi has been thrown around so often in American popular culture, not just with Jerry Seinfeld, with the Nazi, the soup guy, and anytime something terrible happens, it's a Holocaust, and anything that's terrible that we don't like, someone's behaving in a Nazi-like way. It's been 75 years now, well, 73, my math is a little short here, 1945. So it's been since 1945 the war came to an end. Should we be using those terms? What do you think when you hear that phrase, he's behaving like a Nazi, or that sounds like a Nazi idea?
I think I don't think people should use those phrases. I think it trivializes it, and I think sometimes it's done in a careless way where clearly the speaker doesn't really understand perhaps the gravity of who the Nazis really were. But when I increasingly think we should be very careful about language. and that you don't just throw terms around loosely, that you think about what you say. And the easy use or sort of casual use of words like Nazi or comparing somebody to Hitler or calling somebody the Gestapo or all these things that pop up in culture is it's especially offensive in part because I think there are enough people with very firm living memories of what that really meant. But I also think, as I said, it trivializes it and maybe reflects a larger carelessness with how we talk about real evil as opposed to annoyances or things that are less serious. And that I think I'm in favor of some precision with language because I think that it's important.
The Vatican, they were one of the first Christian groups, I think even more than some Jewish groups, to use the Hebrew word Shoah instead of Holocaust. And one of my great Christian leaders and friends, the great Krister Stendahl, who was a Lutheran bishop and the head of the Harvard Divinity School at one time, and the Bishop of Stockholm, he always used to say, if you're going to use the word Holocaust, make sure it has a capital H and only use it for 1933 to 1945. He said, it's not a forest fire, it's not an earthquake, those are terrible things, but the Holocaust, if you're going to use it, capital H. But the Vatican started using some years ago, I don't know exactly when, started using the word Shoah, which means the complete destruction. And Shoah can only mean one thing, and it's very clear. So I've started to use the word Shoah in lieu of Holocaust, and then I have to explain it. So again, I want to commend the Vatican and Roman Catholics for beginning the more popular use of the Hebrew word.
I would just like to say, having been involved with the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies for quite a while, early on I so respect Rabbi Rudin and all the people that have been part of that group. I just think that we're so much more conscious of the reality of how horrible that was. And now the media portrays so many horrible things going on in the world. And for example, the Holocaust Museum is a reminder to all of us of how dangerous, how horrible it can get if we let the little things go by. And, I think the United States has tried so hard to be, in many ways, to be the manager of all these things going on, and it's almost out of control. I don't know that we can do our little parts, but can we do anything to solve any part? I think of myself. I was born in '43, and my daddy went off to war to fight, no matter what the German negativity might have been at the time, or the Jewish negativity, because we were German, we weren't Jews, but we were German, and had a lot of different feelings about that. But our troops went to, maybe too late, whatever, but they went to fight and hopefully saved some Jews because of that victory over Hitler, along with other countries. So I think in some ways we've come a long way, in other ways we're so much more conscious of how important it is. And I think the dialogue that we have within small groups, even like the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies, has made us all much more conscious of one another's difficulties and worries, and how any one of us, any one of our groups, Catholics certainly can be in that category, can be victims as were the Jews. So thank you all for being what you've done for us.
I have a question. I don't know if you can answer this, but I grew up in Wisconsin, which has a very large number of German immigrants, as do certain other states like Texas, for instance. And I wonder if that had any effect on the American response during the time of, the build-up to the Nazi occupations and so forth.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. When you look at the different both ethnic and religious groups in the United States, in terms of religious affiliation, how they responded, The Lutheran Church's reaction was much milder than some of the other churches. I mean, the Lutherans were very divided. Many people of German descent felt that they were both being unfairly attacked in this country, and they had favorable impressions of what was happening in Germany, especially people who still had family members in Germany. So that Lieper, for example, the gentleman I mentioned who worked at the Federal Council of Churches, I've gone through his papers, and he got hate mail from places like Wisconsin and Minnesota and Montana, from Lutherans who said, my brother lives in Germany and he says things are better than they've ever been. So there was pushback among some groups in this country. In fact, I don't know, what part of Lutheran or what part of Wisconsin or what part of Lutheranism you're from, but the Wisconsin Evangelical Synod, which was one of the smaller conservative Lutheran synods, in the interwar period between 1918 and 1939, had actually sent clergy over to Silesia, which was between Poland and Germany, contested territory. It had been part of Germany. After the First World War, it no longer was. And so these were ethnic Germans in Silesia who were unchurched. And the Wisconsin Synod went over and filled in the gap. So you actually had clergy from Wisconsin ministering to ethnic Germans in that region. And when Hitler came into Poland in 1939, they celebrated. And they sent letters back to Wisconsin saying a wonderful thing has happened. And the reason I know this is that I received a call one time at the museum in Washington from a woman in Wisconsin who had been going through her grandfather's papers and came across what she thought was Nazi propaganda. And she said, did German churches send propaganda to Wisconsin Lutherans? And I said, I don't know, but let's look into it. And I discovered the story of so it was not just Nazi propaganda, but it was, messages being sent from these Wisconsin Lutherans to their colleagues they were in Europe, sending them back to Wisconsin. So you look at any American denomination during that period, and every denomination kind of has a different story. There's a new book that has just been published on the American Baptist Church and their responses to the Holocaust, and that too is a really fascinating book. So there's a lot more research that can be done denominationally.
When you attack a problem, make sure that each atrocity that's going on right now, each act of terror, gets its own credence. It is a mistake to lump them all together and say, there's a Holocaust going on in former Burma. That does a disservice to the victims who themselves deserve to be singled out if they are being persecuted. Don't lump them all together in one big bunch. And that's why if it's one tribe against another, make sure you react. That's what I mean by, if everything's a Holocaust, then nothing's a Holocaust. An answer to your Wisconsin question, the kind of reverse side of the coin is I don't think there's anybody here who lived through World War I, except maybe me. But anyway, if you know your history during World War I in this country, the teaching of German was outlawed in schools in Wisconsin because the German immigrants wanted to become Americans. And by teaching German or having German sermons in Lutheran churches and some Catholic churches too, with heavy German-speaking congregation, that was an embarrassment. So it wasn't just a German language, it was a lot of words about food and a lot of things. Germanic was considered un-American during World War I. And what were the Germans called? H-U-N-S, Huns, the Huns. And so it was by the 1930s, and what Dr. Barnett said, some things had changed. But in World War I, there was great fear that German Americans or Americans of German descent would be singled out because once America entered the war in 1917. And so I was shocked when I read that teaching of German in high school and colleges was outlawed for a while.
The comment I want to make first is, I don't know how many of you have been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Can you raise your hands if you have? Then you know how horrible it is to go through it and see the atrocities of the Holocaust. But I have to say that one of the most uplifting experiences is at the end of your tour, the Hall of the Righteous Gentiles. And in that hall, you see all the many priests and teachers and nuns and people in general that hid Jews and or helped them escape through trucks at night and loading children into the trucks. One teacher we heard speak once from Belgium. I mean, it was so heartwarming. It almost saves you from leaving. And I wanted to ask Dr. Barnett, I mean, how many people come through the Holocaust Museum annually? And what are some of the activities they're doing to spread the message?
We get about, I think, 1.8 million visitors a year. And that has stayed steady. I mean, I think this past year I was told that it even increased a little bit, which is interesting because when the museum opened, I think they weren't sure what kind of visitorship we would get at all. We offer a number of educational programs for different professions. We work with the entering classes of the various military academies. We work with police forces. We work with civil servants like judges and lawyers, professional organizations. We had a special exhibit a few years back on the involvement of doctors, German doctors, in the medical profession in Nazi crimes. And for that exhibition, we created a partnership with the American Medical Association and traveled around the country having programs at medical schools. So we really do try to take the elements of the history that the people sort of draw connections to, and talk about and engage in conversation about what German doctors did, what how doctors today face difficult ethical questions. My own work is with clergy and people who teach the field of religious studies, so we get into questions of faith, ethical questions, and it's it's just sort of ongoing work. I don't know that any day is really typical, and one of the interesting things is that sometimes things come up that you don't expect, and you do something with that. So it really is 1.8 million. Yeah. So it's interesting. I've never been bored there, and I've always I don't want to. When I say I enjoy working there, that sounds sort of odd, but I work with a wonderful group of people. The people who work there are just tremendous human beings, and it does. Getting back to the question, what can I do? There is something energizing in working with in a place like that, and finding people who come with that question, and they look at our exhibit and they think, I have to do something. I have to do something wherever I am, in whatever way. And to see that as the outcome of one's work is really a gift. So, thanks.
As we close, I would like to just perhaps make 3 recommendations or 3 suggestions for possibly how we could respond. I know it can be overwhelming to think about responding to some of these thoughts. Perhaps we could take a trip to the Florida Holocaust Museum. We could spend time there in reflection. I also want us to perhaps invite you to sign up on our sign-up sheets. The Center for Catholic Jewish Studies will have more programs like this. Let's perhaps make this just the first of many conversations about this and what we can do. And finally, I want to invite you also to make sure that you connect with me. Before you leave, don't hesitate to stop by and let me know your name and your background. I'm happy to meet you and make a personal connection with the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. We are so grateful for you being here tonight, and perhaps we can also close now by giving our special guests a very warm show of our appreciation.